She thought nobody was watching, but when the billionaire caught his chef's daughter secretly packing leftovers at midnight, he tracked her to a crumbling warehouse. He expected a thief. Instead, he saw her hand the food to a gaunt stranger, and in that next instant, the billionaire's entire world shattered. Because the man was someone he should have saved. What did she know that he didn't? Stay here, because in the next seconds, the truth detonates, and you won't see the ending coming. The estate in the hills above the city was the kind of silent that made $4.2 billion feel hollow. No dinner parties echoing through marble halls. No household staff lingering past evening service. Just the hum of climate control systems regulating air too expensive to breathe wrong, and the faint mechanical whisper of security cameras tracking shadows through empty rooms. Jonathan Ashford tightened the sash on his gray cashmere robe and stepped out of his home office, the glow from 3 monitors still burning ghost images into his retinas. At 58, he'd built everything. Cloud infrastructure that ran half the Fortune 500, venture capital exits that made headlines, a tech empire that had reshaped industries. But at 12:42 a.m. on a Thursday, none of that power could buy him 2 consecutive hours of sleep. He moved through the second-floor hallway on instinct, bare feet soundless on polished concrete floors still cold despite the underfloor heating. Insomnia had transformed the house into a gallery of regrets. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking city lights that never asked questions, modernist furniture no one sat in, space designed for a family he'd never built. Most nights, he wandered until exhaustion finally negotiated a ceasefire with his thoughts. Tonight, something shifted the pattern. A sound too deliberate to belong in a house this quiet. Not the automated systems, not the wind against architectural glass, the soft clink of ceramic on stainless steel. The whisper of containers being stacked with systematic precision. The controlled urgency of someone working against a clock only they could hear. Jonathan stopped mid-step. Every instinct that had warned him before markets collapsed, before partnerships fractured, before companies imploded, now told him something was off. Someone was moving through his industrial kitchen at nearly 1 a.m. And they shouldn't be. He descended the floating concrete staircase toward the kitchen's glass walls, each step calculated to avoid triggering the motion sensors that would flood the space with light. Past the formal dining room still holding the ghost of expensive wine and venture capital promises from tonight's dinner. Security was layered and ruthless. No intruder had breached his perimeter, which meant only one possibility: someone with access. Someone who belonged here during daylight hours, but had no business here now. Whatever waited behind those glass walls wasn't a threat. It was an anomaly. And Jonathan had built his fortune by investigating anomalies. He approached from the side entrance, staying in shadow. Through the transparent walls, pendant lights cast focused pools of illumination over the commercial-grade island. The stainless steel counters reflected the scene in muted doubles, towers of gourmet takeout containers arranged with careful precision, not the cheap disposable kind, but the restaurant-quality ones designed to preserve heat and presentation. And there, working beneath the lights like an artist completing a commission, stood a teenage girl in a red apron. Natalie Torres, 17, his head chef Ricardo's daughter. She moved with practiced efficiency, portioning coq au vin into one container, roasted vegetables with herbs into another, slicing artisan bread, and wrapping it in parchment paper like she was preparing meals for a catering service. Her dark hair was pulled back in a functional ponytail. Her hands worked quickly, but her eyes kept darting toward the doors, toward the windows, checking angles with the nervous precision of someone who knew exactly how much time they had and how catastrophic discovery would be. Jonathan's gaze tracked the details his business instincts automatically cataloged. The systematic nature of the portioning, the quality of the containers, expensive, someone had purchased these specifically, the volume of food, enough for multiple meals, maybe a week. The way she included proper garnish and presentation even though no one would see it but the recipient. She wasn't stealing food. She was rescuing it. Salvaging what would be discarded from tonight's service. The excess from a dinner that had closed a $200 million deal while 12 venture capitalists pretended to care about the plating. Ricardo had finished service 3 hours ago. The kitchen should be locked, dark, empty. But here was his daughter, 17 years old. Operating like this was routine. Like she'd done this 50 times before. Jonathan noticed the worn backpacks slumped near the service entrance. canvas faded from years of use, one strap held together with safety pins. Next to it, a cloth bag from St. Catherine's Church Donation Center, folded men's clothing visible inside. Clean t-shirts, a jacket, socks still in packaging. This wasn't about food. This was a mission. Jonathan stepped into the light. Natalie's hands froze mid-motion, a container of vegetables suspended in the air. Her eyes went wide, not the surprise of being caught doing something wrong, but the terror of being caught doing something necessary. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Then her training kicked in. The training every teenager learns when they grow up in the homes of the wealthy, but don't belong to the wealth themselves. "Mr. Ashford," she said, voice steady despite the panic bleeding through. "I'm so sorry. My dad said I could take some of the excess. For the church. St. Catherine's meal program. We donate sometimes. I should have asked you first. I didn't mean to." The explanation came too smooth, too prepared. A script she'd rehearsed for exactly this scenario. Jonathan let his gaze sweep the scene again. The quality containers. The careful portioning. The men's clothing. The church bag that didn't match the story. "St. Catherine's," he repeated flatly. At 12:47 a.m., Natalie's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "I work late shifts. At a catering company downtown. I just got back and thought I didn't want the food to go to waste. We pack it fresh the next morning usually, but tonight She caught herself spiraling, forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry. I'll clean this up. It won't happen again." She started to repack the containers with shaking hands, moving too fast, the careful precision replaced with frantic damage control. Jonathan studied her, really looked at her for the first time. Natalie had always been peripheral. Ricardo's kid who sometimes helped with prep work during school breaks, quiet and efficient, someone he'd seen maybe a dozen times in 5 years. He'd never bothered to learn more. Now he saw the dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide, the worn Converse sneakers with holes forming at the seams, the cheap digital watch that was probably older than she was. The way her hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd worked professional kitchens, not the fumbling of a teenager playing helper. This girl had a routine, a purpose, a secret she was protecting. "Natalie," Jonathan said, his boardroom voice cutting through her panic. "Stop." She froze. "Who are you feeding?" The question landed like a physical blow. Her face went pale. "No one. I told you it's for. The church doesn't pick up donations at 1 a.m. wearing men's size large clothing." He gestured at the bag. "And they don't need restaurant-quality containers. So I'll ask again, who are you feeding?" Natalie's eyes shimmered. For a moment he thought she might cry. Instead, her spine straightened, chin lifting with a defiance that reminded him uncomfortably of himself at 17. "Someone who needs it," she said quietly. "Someone who doesn't have anyone else." The words hung in the temperature-controlled air. Jonathan's instincts, the ones that had built his empire by reading what people wouldn't say, started assembling pieces of a puzzle he didn't yet understand. A teenage girl sneaking food at midnight. High-quality presentation. Men's clothing. Someone who needs it. Someone who doesn't have anyone else. "Go home," Jonathan said finally. "It's late." Relief and confusion warred across Natalie's features. "But leave it," he interrupted. "I'll handle cleanup. You have school tomorrow." "Mr. Ashford, I promise this won't." "Natalie." He softened his tone fractionally. "Go home. We'll talk about this later." She hesitated, then grabbed her backpack and the church bag, leaving the containers on the counter. As she slipped past him toward the service exit, she paused. "Thank you," she whispered. But it didn't sound like gratitude. It sounded like a plea he didn't understand yet. The door closed behind her with a pneumatic sigh. Jonathan stood alone in the industrial kitchen, surrounded by carefully portioned meals meant for someone Natalie was protecting. He picked up one of the containers, Coke au vin still warm, garnished with fresh thyme. The kind of care you showed when feeding someone mattered. This wasn't charity. This was personal. His mind shifted into investigation mode, the same process that had identified market opportunities before competitors saw them coming. A 17-year-old girl with a secret mission. Food packed with dignity. Men's clothing. Someone who doesn't have anyone else. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt something other than the hollow ache of insomnia. He felt the electric current of a pattern emerging, a story already in motion that had been unfolding in his kitchen, in his home, while he'd been too buried in his empire to notice. He left the containers where they were, turned off the pendant lights, and headed back to his office. Sleep was no longer the objective. Answers were. By the time the first gray light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Jonathan Ashford had made his decision. If a teenage girl was running midnight supply routes to help someone invisible, someone the world had given up on, he needed to know who, and why she felt responsible for someone the man with unlimited resources, apparently wasn't. His first action would be surveillance. Not invasive, just observational. He'd follow her next delivery, see where the route led, who was on the receiving end of Natalie's carefully packaged compassion. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice he'd been ignoring for 5 years whispered a question he'd been too afraid to ask. What if the person Natalie was feeding was someone you should have been feeding all along? If this opening hit you harder than you expected, don't just scroll like Natalie is some fictional character. Right now, real people are going hungry while others sleep in mansions with locked kitchens. Hit subscribe so you don't miss how this midnight secret detonates Jonathan's entire world, and drop a comment with the time you're watching from. If you can check the clock from the comfort of your bed, the least you can do is care enough to see this through. 3 nights passed like a held breath. Jonathan sat through board meetings about acquisitions he didn't care about, approved budgets that would have changed lives if directed differently, smiled at dinner parties where the wine cost more than most people's monthly rent. But his mind stayed in that kitchen, stayed with Natalie's trembling hands and careful portioning, stayed with the question, who doesn't have anyone else? Thursday night at 12:15 a.m., Jonathan positioned himself in the shadows of the second-floor hallway overlooking the kitchen, waiting, watching. His Tesla was parked in the lower garage, positioned for a quiet exit. At 12:31 a.m., like clockwork, the kitchen lights flickered on. Natalie appeared through the service entrance, red apron already tied, moving with the practiced efficiency of routine. Jonathan watched from above as she repeated the ritual. Same methodical movements. Same quality containers pulled from the supply closet. Not stolen, he realized now, but purchased separately and stored here for convenience. She worked the island like a prep station, dividing portions with the precision of someone who understood hunger wasn't just about calories, but dignity. He noticed what he'd missed 3 nights ago. She only touched leftovers. The cocoa vin that would have been discarded tomorrow. The roasted vegetables from tonight's service that wouldn't survive a reheat. The artisan bread already starting to harden at the edges. She never touched ingredients prepped for tomorrow's menu. Never took anything that would be missed. This wasn't theft. It was salvage with purpose. She worked for 17 minutes, then packed everything into an insulated delivery bag. Another personal purchase, Jonathan noted. The church donation bag sat beside it. Same men's clothing visible through the canvas. Clean socks. A hoodie. A flannel shirt still creased from packaging. When she slipped out the service exit, Jonathan was already moving toward the garage. The Tesla's electric motor made no sound as Jonathan followed at a distance, headlights extinguished, letting the vehicle's night vision cameras guide him through the residential streets. Natalie walked 3 blocks to the main road, her silhouette small under the streetlights, the insulated bag slung across her shoulder like it weighed nothing despite carrying enough food for days. She boarded the 47 bus heading downtown. Jonathan followed in the Tesla, tracking the bus's stops through empty streets where his venture capital dollars flowed in reverse, away from investment toward abandonment. The neighborhoods shifted like geological strata. Manicured lawns gave way to apartment complexes with broken security gates. Coffee shops became liquor stores behind plexiglass. The architecture of wealth dissolved into the infrastructure of survival. Natalie got off at Industrial Boulevard, a stretch of the city Jonathan only knew from zoning maps and investment avoidance lists. Crumbling warehouses lined both sides of the street, their windows shattered or boarded, graffiti layered so thick it looked like urban archaeology. Streetlights flickered or stayed dark. The few businesses still operating had roll-down security gates covered in rust and warning signs. This was where his city's economic miracle didn't reach, where families lived in motels by the week, where abandoned factories stood as monuments to manufacturing jobs that had moved overseas, while men like Jonathan built empires in the cloud. Jonathan parked 2 blocks back and followed on foot, staying in shadows his 17-year-old guide seemed to navigate without fear. She walked with purpose, no hesitation, no checking over her shoulder. She'd done this route 100 times. Maybe more. Natalie turned down an alley between two massive warehouse structures, both at least 50 years old, windows blown out, loading docks collapsed into piles of concrete and rebar. She approached a rusted side entrance, pulled it open with practiced ease, and disappeared inside. Jonathan waited 30 seconds, then followed. The door opened silently. Someone had oiled the hinges. Inside, the warehouse stretched into darkness punctuated by holes in the ceiling where moonlight fell through like spotlights on an empty stage. The air smelled of dust, rust, and something else, humanity. The lingering trace of meals cooked on camp stoves, of clothes worn too many days, of spaces not designed for living being lived in any way. Jonathan moved carefully through the debris field of industrial abandonment, collapsed pallets, overturned equipment, puddles from the last rain that would breed mosquitoes by summer. In the far corner, maybe 60 yards from the entrance, a warm glow pulsed like a heartbeat. He approached a broken window overlooking the corner space and looked through. Someone had created a makeshift room using hanging tarps as walls. Inside, a battery-powered camping lantern cast golden light over a surprisingly organized living space. A sleeping bag laid out on cardboard for insulation from the concrete floor. Stacks of books, paperbacks with broken spines, a few hardcovers that looked salvaged from library discard piles. A milk crate serving as a side table held a plastic water bottle, a worn Bible, and what looked like a journal. Clean clothes folded neatly in another crate. A small camping stove. Toiletries arranged with the precision of someone trying to maintain dignity against impossible odds. And there, sitting on an overturned bucket, reading by lantern light while he waited, a man. Even from this distance, even in the uncertain light, Jonathan could see the gauntness of severe weight loss. The weathered skin of someone who'd lived outside too long. The threadbare jacket and jeans that hung on a frame that had once been larger, stronger. Hair that had gone gray from stress more than age. Hands that trembled slightly as they turned the page of a book whose title Jonathan couldn't read. Natalie ducked through the tarp entrance, and the man looked up. His face transformed. Not quite a smile, but something like hope remembered. Jonathan couldn't hear their words through the broken window, but he could read the body language. Familiarity, trust, routine. Natalie unpacked the containers with practiced efficiency, setting them on the makeshift table like she was serving in a restaurant. The man tried to refuse something, probably quantity, and Natalie insisted with hand gestures that meant you need this. She pulled out the clothing from the church bag. The man held up the flannel shirt, and for a moment his shoulders shook. Crying or laughing, Jonathan couldn't tell. Maybe both. They ate together, just for a few minutes. Two people sharing a meal in an abandoned warehouse while the city slept in comfort around them. The man said something that made Natalie laugh. Actual laughter, her head thrown back. Then she was checking her watch, apologizing for leaving so quickly, the man waving her off with understanding. She gathered the empty containers, leaving the full ones arranged carefully. The man stood to walk her to the tarp entrance, and as he did, he stepped fully into the lantern light. Jonathan's world stopped. The face was different, gaunt where it had been full, lined where it had been smooth, bearded where it had been clean-shaven. The eyes were hollow where they'd once been sharp. The posture was defeated where it had once been defiant. But the bone structure didn't lie. The shape of the jaw, the set of the ears, the way he tilted his head when listening. Jonathan had grown up looking at that face across breakfast tables and hospital waiting rooms and courtrooms and rehab facilities, and finally, 5 years ago, across one last explosive argument that ended with Jonathan's ultimatum and David's fury, and then, nothing. 5 years of nothing. 5 years of telling himself David was either clean or dead, and being too terrified to find out which. 5 years of building billion-dollar companies while his brother built a shelter from tarps in an abandoned warehouse. David Ashford, his brother, alive. Jonathan's hands pressed against the broken window frame, legs suddenly unreliable. The glass bit into his palm, drawing blood he didn't feel. Through the window, Natalie hugged David, brief, familial, and slipped back through the tarp. David stood there for a moment alone, staring at the containers of food like they were more than food, like they were proof that someone remembered he was human. Then he sat back down on his overturned bucket, picked up his book, and continued reading by lantern light in an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district where Jonathan's venture capital dollars would never flow, where his brother had been living, surviving, waiting, for 7 months, while Jonathan closed deals and built empires and slept, barely, in a mansion in the hills. 7 months. Maybe longer. Jonathan's breath came in short, sharp gasps. His vision blurred. The warehouse spun. 58 years old, worth $4.2 billion. And in this moment, he couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't process the impossible mathematics of a teenage girl doing what a billionaire couldn't. Showing up. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably a market alert from Tokyo. He didn't check it. He stood there in the dark, watching his brother read by lantern light in a room made of tarps, and realized he'd been wrong about everything. David wasn't lost. David was right here. Jonathan had just been too afraid, or too busy building walls out of billions, to come looking. Jonathan retreated to his Tesla, hands trembling so violently he couldn't grip the door handle on the first attempt. He collapsed into the driver's seat, the leather cold against his back, and stared through the windshield at nothing. At everything. David is alive. The brother he'd cut off 5 years ago. The brother he'd convinced himself was either clean or dead, and had been too terrified to find out which. The brother he'd abandoned to this. To tarps and camping lanterns and borrowed dignity delivered by a 17-year-old girl who understood compassion better than a man worth $4.2 billion. His chest constricted. The air in the car felt thin, insufficient. He pressed his palms against his eyes until white spots bloomed in the darkness. 5 years ago, the call came at 2:47 a.m. Jonathan had been in his downtown condo, reviewing acquisition documents, when his phone lit up with David's number. The 12th call that week. He'd ignored the first 11. This time, something made him answer. John. David's voice was wrecked, slurred at the edges. I need help, man. I can't do this anymore. Which rehab did you walk out of this time? Jonathan had asked, exhaustion sharpening into anger. Clearview? Mountainside? The place in Malibu that cost 80 grand for 30 days? That's not. David's breath hitched. Please. I'm trying. I just need. You need money. Jonathan cut him off. You always need money. And I'm done being the ATM that funds your slow-motion suicide. Silence. Then, our parents died because of you. The words landed like a physical blow. Jonathan's hand had tightened on the phone until the case cracked. Don't. You were driving, David continued, voice raw. Distracted by some business call. Some deal that was more important than watching the road. They died because you couldn't put down your phone for 5 goddamn minutes. That's not fair. Fair. David laughed, bitter and broken. You turned their death into rocket fuel for your career. Built your empire on guilt. And I got pills because I was 16 and couldn't handle burying my parents after watching them bleed out. But yeah, John, let's talk about fair. Jonathan had stood there in his luxury condo, surrounded by evidence of his success, and felt the foundation crack beneath him. Because David was right. About all of it. The accident had been his fault. He'd been negotiating terms on his first major contract. Phone pressed to his ear, eyes flicking between the road and his notes. He'd run the red light doing 45. The SUV hit the passenger side where his parents sat. His father died on impact. His mother made it 6 hours. Jonathan had walked away with a concussion and a business card from a grief counselor he never called. David, 16 years old, had walked away with a prescription for Vicodin after the funeral. Then OxyContin for the back pain he claimed wouldn't stop. Then something stronger a friend sold him. Then something stronger than that. For 6 years, Jonathan tried to fix it. For different rehabilitation facilities, each more expensive than the last. Private interventions with specialists who spoke in soothing tones about addiction as disease. Sober living houses where David lasted 3 weeks before relapsing. Therapy, medication-assisted treatment, every evidence-based program money could access. Each time, David got clean. Stayed clean for weeks, sometimes months. Looked like the brother Jonathan remembered, clear-eyed, sharp, alive. And each time, something triggered a relapse. A stressful day, an old friend, the anniversary of their parents' death, the weight of carrying grief and blame, and the ghost of a future that kept slipping through his fingers. After the 7th rehab, Jonathan made the ultimatum. This is the last time, he'd said, standing in David's sober living apartment. You relapse again, I'm done. No more facilities. No more rent. No more emergency cash. You're 52 years old. At some point, you have to want this more than I want it for you. David had looked at him with eyes that already knew how the story would end. And if I can't, then I can't watch you die slowly on my dime while pretending I'm helping. For months later, David relapsed. Jonathan got the call from the sober living manager. David had been found unconscious, revived with Narcan, refused further treatment. Jonathan hadn't called him back, hadn't checked on him, hadn't asked where he'd gone after leaving the facility. He told himself it was tough love, that enabling was killing them both, that David needed to hit bottom before he'd climb back up. He told himself a lot of things. Then he buried himself in work, launched 3 new ventures, closed deals in Singapore and Frankfurt and Sao Paulo, built his empire higher, wider, until the walls were thick enough that he couldn't hear the silence from David's side. Back in the present, Jonathan's hands had stopped shaking, but the nausea remained. He'd never followed up, never checked hospitals or shelters or arrest records, never drove through the neighborhoods where people ended up when the money ran out and the family gave up, never did the basic, human thing of asking, "Is my brother alive?" He'd been too afraid of the answer. Too afraid that confirming David's death would collapse the comfortable lie he'd built, that cutting him off was mercy, that walking away was strength, that some people couldn't be saved, so why keep trying? But David hadn't died. He'd survived, living in an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district, reading by lantern light, accepting food from a teenage girl who'd shown him more compassion in 7 months than his billionaire brother had shown in 5 years. The accident that killed their parents replayed in Jonathan's mind with brutal clarity. The phone call he'd prioritized, the red light he'd run, his mother's last words in the ambulance. Take care of your brother. He'd failed. Spectacularly, completely, unforgivably. David had turned to pills to numb the trauma. Jonathan had turned to work. Same wound. Different painkillers. Only one of them got labeled an addict. By the time dawn broke over the industrial district, Jonathan was back in his home office, exhausted but wired, staring at his computer screen. He'd spent 3 hours searching. Homeless shelter databases, nothing. Arrest records, nothing recent. Hospital admission logs, nothing under David Ashford. His brother had become invisible, erased from every system designed to track and help people who'd fallen through society's cracks. Or maybe David had made himself invisible, ashamed to use his real name, ashamed to access help that might trace back to the family he'd lost. Then Jonathan thought about Natalie. How does a 17-year-old girl find a homeless man who doesn't want to be found? He waited until 8 a.m., then walked down to the kitchen where Ricardo was already prepping for the day's service. "Morning, Mr. Ashford," Ricardo said, surprised. Jonathan rarely appeared before 10 a.m. Coffee. "Please." Jonathan accepted the cup, then tried to sound casual. "Your daughter seems dedicated. I saw her the other night, working late." Ricardo's face lit up with paternal pride. "Natalie? She's incredible. Takes after her mother. God rest her. Always thinking of others. She volunteers at St. Catherine's Church downtown most weekends. They run a meal program for people experiencing homelessness." The pieces clicked into place. "She helps serve?" Jonathan asked. "Serves, cooks, organizes donations." Ricardo smiled. "She wants to study social work eventually, maybe become a counselor. Says everyone deserves dignity, no matter their circumstances. I worry she's too compassionate sometimes. Takes on other people's burdens like they're her own." Jonathan's throat tightened. "St. Catherine's. That's downtown, near the industrial district?" "About 20 minutes by bus," Ricardo confirmed. "Rough neighborhood, but the church does good work. Natalie says it's where she feels most useful." Jonathan set down his coffee cup carefully, afraid his hands might betray him. Natalie was the bridge he'd never built, the connection his money and power and intelligence hadn't been able to construct. A 17-year-old girl had succeeded where a billionaire failed. She'd seen David at St. Catherine's, probably months ago, maybe longer, recognized a man in need. And instead of walking past him like Jonathan had been doing metaphorically for 5 years, she'd stopped, asked questions, listened, learned where he lived. And then she'd shown up, at midnight, with food packed carefully to preserve dignity, with clean clothes donated from the church, with the simple, radical act of treating him like he mattered. She hadn't needed venture capital or strategic plans or interventions with specialists. She just needed to see David as human. Jonathan excused himself from the kitchen and returned to his office. He stood at the window overlooking the city, watching the morning light spread across buildings and neighborhoods, including the industrial district where his brother was probably waking up in a warehouse, surrounded by tarps, wondering if tonight Natalie would come again, wondering if anyone else remembered he existed. "I'm sorry," Jonathan whispered to the glass, to the city, to the brother who couldn't hear him. Then he picked up his phone and started making calls. Not to rehab facilities or intervention specialists this time. To himself. To the coward who'd spent 5 years hiding behind the excuse of tough love while a teenager did the actual work of loving. Whatever came next, Jonathan knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going to let another day pass in silence. Jonathan didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw David's face in the lantern light. Gaunt, weathered, but alive. Alive and abandoned. The next night, he positioned himself in the kitchen before midnight, sitting at the island counter in complete darkness. No lights, no phone glow, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and his own pulse hammering in his ears. At 12:31 a.m., the service entrance opened. Natalie stepped inside, red apron already tied, insulated bag over her shoulder. She reached for the light switch. "We need to talk about where you're really taking that food." Natalie's hand froze midair. She spun toward his voice, eyes wide in the darkness. Jonathan flicked on the pendant lights above the island. The sudden illumination caught her in harsh relief. Fear stamped across her features, followed immediately by something that looked like defiance. "Mr. Ashford." Her voice came out steady, but her grip on the bag strap turned her knuckles white. "I explained this already. It's for St. Catherine's. It's for my brother." The words dropped between them like a stone into still water. Natalie's face went pale. "I don't know what." "I followed you," Jonathan said quietly. 3 nights ago. Watched you take the 47 bus to Industrial Boulevard. Watched you walk into that warehouse like you've done it 100 times before. Watched you deliver food to a man living in a room made of tarps." Her breath hitched. "Mr. Ashford, I can explain." "David." His voice cracked on the name. "The man you've been feeding is David Ashford. My brother." Natalie's shoulders sagged. The defiance drained out of her posture all at once, replaced by something that looked like resignation mixed with guilt. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Not at first." "Sit down," Jonathan said, gentler now. "Please." She hesitated, then set the insulated bag on the counter and slid onto a stool across from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The kitchen's expensive silence pressed in around them. "How did you find him?" Jonathan finally asked. Natalie looked at her hands, fingers twisting together. "He found me," she said quietly. 8 months ago. I thought he was going to hurt me." The memory came out haltingly, like she was pulling fragments from a drawer she'd tried to keep closed. It was 11 at night, maybe later. Natalie had been walking home from a catering gig downtown, a corporate event that had run over, some tech company celebrating another funding round. She'd pocketed $200 in tips and was planning to put it toward her college savings. The shortcut through the alley had always been safe enough. Well lit at the entrance, quick route to the bus stop. But that night, halfway through, she realized the streetlight at the far end had burned out. 3 men stepped out from behind a dumpster. "Nice night for a walk," one said, his smile wrong in all the ways that made her stomach drop. "Let's see what you got in that bag, sweetheart." Natalie had frozen. All the self-defense classes she'd taken, all the advice about fighting back or running, it all evaporated. She just stood there, bag clutched to her chest, while they moved closer. "Phone," another demanded. "Cash. Anything else worth taking." She fumbled with her bag, hands shaking so badly she couldn't get the zipper open. One of them stepped forward, reaching. That's when David appeared. Natalie hadn't heard him coming, hadn't seen where he emerged from. But suddenly there was a man standing between her and the attackers, tall, broad despite being too thin, wearing a jacket that had seen better years and jeans that hung loose on his frame. "Leave her alone." His voice was rough and used to speaking. But there was something in it, authority, maybe, or the kind of desperate unpredictability that made even predators hesitate. "The fuck off, old man," one of the attackers said. "This ain't your business." "I'm making it my business." David didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon or make threats. He just stood there, positioned like a wall. She's a kid. You want someone's stuff? Try me. But she walks away. Now, for 3 seconds, the alley held its breath. Then one of the attackers pulled a knife. Not large, but enough. David didn't flinch, just stared at them with eyes that had seen worse things than a blade in an alley. Eyes that suggested he had absolutely nothing left to lose. Your funeral, the man with the knife muttered. But something in David's stillness unnerved them. They backed off, disappearing into the dark at the alley's far end with muttered curses and threats that never materialized. Natalie stood there, shaking, while David remained between her and where they'd gone, making sure they didn't come back. Finally, he turned. You okay? She nodded, then immediately started crying. Relief, fear, adrenaline all hitting at once. David stood awkwardly nearby, clearly uncomfortable. Thank you, she managed through tears. I don't, thank you. Can I? She fumbled with her bag. I have money. Cash. You saved my life. Please let me. Keep it. His voice was firm, but not unkind. You earned it. I didn't. But you. I didn't do anything worth paying for, he interrupted. Just did what anyone should have done. You're safe. That's what matters. He started to walk away. Wait, Natalie called. What's your name? He paused, looked back. In the dim light from the alley entrance, she could see his face properly for the first time. Weathered, tired, but with eyes that carried something like sadness mixed with stubborn dignity. David, he said finally. Then he disappeared into the shadows. I couldn't stop thinking about him, Natalie told Jonathan, her voice quiet in the expensive kitchen. This homeless man who saved me and wouldn't take $1, who just asked if I was okay and walked away. She'd gone to St. Catherine's the next weekend, the church where she volunteered with the meal program. Asked around, described the man. Nobody knew a David specifically, but they said lots of people cycled through, staying invisible. 3 weeks later, she saw him in line for dinner service. Recognized him immediately. I brought him extra food, Natalie said. Tried to thank him again. He just nodded, didn't want to make a scene. But I kept coming back. And gradually, he started talking. Little things. Never about his past, just current stuff. Books he was reading. The weather. How the city had changed. Then came the company event at Jonathan's house 6 weeks ago, an anniversary celebration for his tech company's founding. Ricardo had been hired to cater. Natalie helped serve. There were photos everywhere, she said. You'd set up this whole display in the entrance hall. Company history, family history, your journey from law to tech. And there, in one of the old frames, was a photo of 2 young men. Brothers, the caption said. Jonathan and David Ashford. She'd recognized David immediately. Younger, healthier, clean-shaven, but unmistakably the same bone structure, the same eyes. I couldn't understand it, Natalie said, anger creeping into her voice. You're a billionaire. He's homeless. And your brothers? I kept thinking there had to be some explanation. Maybe you didn't know. Maybe he'd vanished, or you tried to help and he'd refused. So she'd researched. Found articles about David's addiction, Jonathan's attempts at intervention, the final falling out 5 years ago. Found nothing after that, just silence. Then I asked David, Natalie continued, carefully, about his family. He wouldn't talk about it at first, but eventually he told me. He had a brother who'd given up on him, who'd decided he wasn't worth saving anymore. And David believed it, believed he was worthless, that he deserved to be forgotten. Her eyes met Jonathan's, and there was accusation in them now. So I started bringing him food. Real food, not just shelter meals. Clean clothes from church donations. And most importantly, I started showing up. Consistently. Every few nights. Reminding him that someone remembered he was human. He's clean, Natalie added. Did you know that? He's been attending NA meetings at St. Catherine's for 4 months. 97 days sober as of yesterday. Goes to meetings 3 times a week. Has a sponsor. Is doing the actual work of recovery. Jonathan's chest tightened. 97 days? He wanted to reach out to you, Natalie said. Kept saying maybe when he hit 6 months clean, he'd call. Prove he was serious this time. But he was terrified you'd hang up. Convinced you hated him. That he'd burned that bridge so completely there was no point in even trying. She stood, anger and compassion warring in her expression. He saved my life, Natalie said, voice shaking. Some homeless addict everyone else walked past saved a 17-year-old girl from getting robbed, or worse. He had nothing. He is nothing, according to society. But he stepped between me and danger anyway. She grabbed her insulated bag, started toward the door, then turned back. So I'm trying to save his, she finished, tears streaming now. Bringing him food, bringing him dignity, reminding him 3 times a week that he matters. That's my excuse for sneaking around at midnight. Her eyes locked onto Jonathan's. What's yours for not doing the same? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Then Natalie walked out, leaving Jonathan alone in his industrial kitchen, surrounded by stainless steel and pendant lights and the crushing weight of 5 years of silence he could never take back. Jonathan waited in his Tesla outside the warehouse, engine off, watching the broken entrance where Natalie had disappeared 20 minutes earlier. His hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. For 5 years, he'd avoided this moment, convinced himself David was better off without him. That distance was kindness. That silence was protection. Natalie's words echoed in his skull. What's your excuse for not doing the same? He didn't have one. Not one that mattered. Not one that could stand up to a 17-year-old girl showing more courage in 7 months than he'd shown in 5 years. Jonathan opened the car door and stepped into the night. This time, he wouldn't hide in shadows. This time, he'd face his brother, not as a billionaire, not as someone with all the answers, but as the man who'd failed him when it mattered most. He crossed the empty street toward the warehouse, gravel crunching under his expensive shoes. Shoes that cost more than David probably spent on food in a month. The irony wasn't lost on him. The rusted door opened silently on oiled hinges. Jonathan moved through the darkness, guided by the warm glow from the far corner. As he approached, voices filtered through the industrial space, muffled at first, then clearer. Laughter. Jonathan stopped, the sound hitting him like a physical blow. He hadn't heard David laugh in decades. Not since before their parents died. Not since before pills and rehab and interventions and ultimatums turned laughter into a memory. He moved closer, staying just outside the tarp-enclosed space, and listened. So the priest looks at the rabbi and says, "That's not a chicken, that's the bishop." David's voice, rough but animated. Natalie's laughter rang out, genuine, unguarded. "That's terrible. Terrible jokes are the best jokes," David said. Jonathan could hear the smile in his voice. "They're so bad they circle back to good. My dad tells jokes like that," Natalie said. "Drives me crazy." "Your dad's a good man," David replied, quieter now. "Raising a kid who sneaks around at midnight feeding homeless people. He did something right." "He doesn't know," Natalie admitted. "About the midnight part. He knows I volunteer at St. Catherine's. Just not this." "You should tell him," David said gently. "Parents worry. And you, what you're doing. It's not something to be ashamed of," says the man who won't call his own brother. Silence. "Then, that's different." "How?" "Because John has every right to hate me," David said, voice heavy. "I burned that bridge, set it on fire, and watched it collapse. You can't come back from that." "He doesn't hate you," Natalie said firmly. "He just doesn't know you're alive." David finished. "Maybe that's better. Easier for everyone. I'm doing okay now. 97 days. Got a sponsor. Going to meetings. But what if I relapse again? What if I fail again? Better he remembers me as someone who couldn't be saved than watch me prove it one more time." Jonathan's chest tightened. Every word was a knife sliding between his ribs. "You're not going to relapse," Natalie said. "You don't know that." "I believe it," she countered. "And that has to count for something." Through the gap in the tarps, Jonathan saw them sitting on overturned crates, sharing the food Natalie had brought. David looked healthier than he had through the window 3 nights ago. Or maybe it was just the warmth of companionship making him seem less gaunt, less defeated. He looked like someone worth saving. He looked like family. Jonathan took a breath and stepped into the light. David's face drained of color. The plastic fork slipped from his fingers, hitting the concrete floor with a small clatter that echoed in the sudden silence. For 5 seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Natalie stood immediately, positioning herself between the brothers, protective, uncertain. Jonathan and David stared at each other across 5 years of silence, guilt, and pain that had calcified into something they both stopped believing could be broken. David's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "John." The single word, his name, spoken in his brother's voice, nearly undid Jonathan completely. David's eyes held everything: shock, fear, shame, Desperate hope followed immediately by the expectation of rejection. He looked like a man preparing for the blow he'd convinced himself he deserved. Jonathan opened his mouth, but no sound came. What do you say to the brother you abandoned? How do you apologize for 5 years of silence? Where do you even start? He began, then stopped. Natalie's hands clenched into fists. Her head swiveled between them, and Jonathan saw the war in her expression, compassion fighting with anger, hope battling frustration. Then she exploded. You bet millions on strangers with ideas. Her voice cracked through the warehouse like a whip. She turned to Jonathan, eyes blazing. Complete strangers walk into your office with pitch decks and business plans, and you write checks for amounts that could change entire families' lives. You invest in people you've never met, companies that might fail, technologies that might never work. And you do it constantly. She gestured at David. But your own brother? Your own blood? He's right here. 97 days clean. Going to meetings. Reading recovery books. Actually doing the work. And you? Her voice broke. You gave up on him 5 years ago and never looked back. Natalie, David tried. No. She cut him off, spinning to face him. And you? You talk about him constantly. Every time I bring food, you mention something. John always liked this. John used to make me laugh. I wonder how John's doing. You carry him with you every single day, but you're too ashamed to pick up a phone. David flinched. I don't want to. To what? Disappoint him again? Natalie's voice gentled, but the steel remained. You're already disappointing him by assuming he doesn't care. By assuming he wouldn't want to know you're alive and fighting. She turned back to Jonathan. And you built an entire empire running from the same pain that drove him to pills. Your parents died, and you both broke, just in different directions. He found opioids. You found work. He numbed himself with substances. You numbed yourself with success. The words hit Jonathan like bullets, each one finding its mark. You're both running from the same ghost, Natalie continued, tears streaming now. The same accident. The same guilt. The same loss. You blame yourself for the crash. He blames himself for not being strong enough to handle it. And you've both spent years punishing yourselves instead of facing it together. She looked between them. These two broken men separated by 5 feet and 5 years and 5 million unspoken words. Maybe, she said quietly, it's time you stop running and face it together. The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan's vision blurred. His hands trembled. Every instinct screamed at him to maintain control, to present the composed billionaire face that had gotten him through boardrooms and negotiations and crisis management. But standing in an abandoned warehouse, surrounded by tarps and camping lanterns and the brother he'd left behind, that mask finally cracked. I thought you were dead. His voice broke on the words. I thought, God, David, I thought you'd overdosed in some motel room or alley, and I was too much of a coward to find out. Too afraid to check hospitals or morgues. Too afraid to face what my abandonment had done. David's eyes widened, tears spilling over. I told myself it was tough love, Jonathan continued. That cutting you off was the hard thing, the right thing. But it wasn't. It was the easy thing. Because watching you struggle meant facing my own failure. My guilt. The fact that I killed our parents, and you paid the price while I built an empire on top of their grave. John, David's voice was barely a whisper. Every billion was an apology I never gave you, Jonathan said. Every building, every company, every deal. It was me trying to fix something that money can't fix. Trying to fill the hole that crash left in both of us. But all I did was build walls between us. And by the time I realized it, I was too afraid to tear them down. David stood slowly, unsteady on his feet. I thought you didn't care. His voice cracked. I thought. After everything I put you through, all the relapses and broken promises, I thought you decided I wasn't worth the trouble anymore. That you'd finally realized I was a lost cause. You were never a lost cause, Jonathan said. I was just too broken to see past my own guilt. I was too ashamed to reach out, David admitted. Thought if I could get 6 months clean, maybe a year, I could prove I'd changed. That I deserved another chance. But every day I didn't call felt like another day of proof that I'd burned that bridge too badly to rebuild. They stood there, 5 feet apart, years of pain and guilt and silence stretching between them like a chasm. Then Jonathan closed the distance. He didn't say anything, didn't offer explanations or conditions or promises, just stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his brother. This gaunt, weathered man who smelled like old clothes and survival, who'd been living in a warehouse while Jonathan slept in a mansion in the hills. David's body went rigid with shock. Then, slowly, his arms came up. His hands gripped the back of Jonathan's jacket, expensive fabric in his calloused fingers, and he held on like a drowning man finding solid ground. They stood like that for a long time. Two brothers who'd spent 5 years convincing themselves the other was lost, finally understanding they'd both just been too afraid to reach across the silence. When they finally pulled apart, both their faces were wet. 97 days, Jonathan said, voice hoarse. Natalie told me. That's incredible, David. Might not be enough, David said. Might relapse tomorrow. Then we'll deal with tomorrow, Jonathan replied. Together, if you'll let me. David's laugh came out broken and disbelieving. You're serious? I should have been here 5 years ago, Jonathan said. I can't change that, but I can be here now. If you'll give me another chance to be the brother I should have been. The walls between them didn't collapse, didn't vanish. 5 years of silence couldn't be erased with one conversation in a warehouse. But they cracked, just enough to let light through, just enough to start rebuilding. The cafe was small, tucked between a bookstore and a thrift shop 2 blocks from St. Catherine's Church. The kind of place that served decent coffee and didn't ask questions when customers sat for hours nursing a single cup. Jonathan arrived 15 minutes early, chose a corner table away from the windows, and waited. His hands wouldn't stop moving, adjusting his watch, straightening the napkin, checking his phone for messages that hadn't arrived. He'd closed billion-dollar deals with less anxiety than this. At 2:47 p.m., the door opened. David stepped inside. He'd cleaned up, showered at St. Catherine's, probably, wearing donated clothes that were clean but didn't quite fit. A button-down shirt that hung loose on his frame. Jeans that were newer than the ones from the warehouse. His hair was combed back, beard trimmed. He looked nervous, sober, wary. Their eyes met across the cafe. For a moment, neither moved. Then Jonathan raised his hand slightly, a small gesture that meant here, I'm here, and David walked over, each step looking like it required conscious effort. Thanks for meeting me, Jonathan said as David sat down. Wasn't sure you'd actually show, David admitted. His voice was quiet, rough from disuse. I wasn't sure you would either. They sat in uncomfortable silence while a barista brought water and menus. David stared at his glass like it held answers he couldn't quite read. I've been researching, Jonathan said finally. Treatment facilities. The best ones in the state. Hell, in the country. There's a place called Turning Point Recovery Center. 90-day inpatient program. Private rooms, medical supervision, individual therapy 3 times a week, group sessions, holistic approaches. They have a 72% long-term success rate. David's fingers tightened around his water glass. After the 90 days, transition to sober living, Jonathan continued. Ongoing support. Job placement assistance. Family therapy if that's something you'd want. And I'd cover everything. All of it. Whatever it costs. The words came out in a rush, like Jonathan had been rehearsing them for hours. Which he had. David didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, staring at the condensation running down his water glass, jaw working like he was grinding words between his teeth. Finally, no. The word landed flat and final. Jonathan blinked. What? No. David repeated, looking up. His eyes were clear but guarded. I appreciate it, John. I do. But no. David, this is the best program available. They have specialists in opioid addiction, trauma-informed care, the highest success rates. I've heard it before. David cut him off gently but firmly. The best facility. The best doctors. The best chance. I've done 4 of the best facilities money could buy, and I relapsed after every single one. This time could be different. That's what we said last time, David said. And the time before that. And the time before that. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion written in every line of his face. I'm 97 days clean right now, John. Doing it on my own with NA meetings and a church basement and a 17-year-old kid who brings me leftovers. That's working. What if I go to your fancy facility and it doesn't? What if I come out 30 days later and score within a week? Then we try again, Jonathan said desperately. No. David's voice cracked. I can't be your project, John. I can't be the broken thing you throw money at to fix your guilt. I've been that before. It didn't work for either of us. That's not what this is. isn't it? David challenged. His hands were shaking now. You disappeared for 5 years. Didn't call, didn't check, didn't care if I was alive or dead. And now you show up, and suddenly you want to save me? That's not about me, John. That's about you feeling better about abandoning me. The accusation hung between them like smoke. Jonathan's throat constricted, his vision blurred. Every defense he'd prepared crumbled under the weight of truth he could no longer avoid. You're right, he whispered. David's eyes widened slightly. You're absolutely right, Jonathan repeated, louder now. His hands gripped the edge of the table. It is about me. About my guilt. About the fact that I've spent 5 years, no, longer than that, running from something I should have faced the day our parents died. He forced himself to meet David's eyes. The accident was my fault. David opened his mouth, but Jonathan pressed forward. I was driving. Mom and Dad were in the passenger seats. I was on the phone, business call, some deal that was supposed to make me my first million. I ran a red light doing 45 miles an hour because I was looking at my notes instead of the road. The SUV hit the passenger side. They died. I walked away. Jonathan's voice fractured. You were 16 years old. You just lost both parents in an accident your brother caused. And instead of being there for you, instead of facing that guilt together, I buried myself in work. Built my empire on top of their grave while you turned to pills to numb the pain I caused. Tears streamed down his face now, years of suppressed grief finally breaking through. Every building I built was an apology I never gave you, Jonathan said. Every billion was me trying to fix something that couldn't be bought. Every deal was me running further from the moment I should have stopped and said, I killed our parents, and I'm so sorry you had to carry that alone. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I cut you off because watching you suffer was watching my own failure. Watching you relapse was proof that I'd broken you and couldn't fix it. So I walked away and convinced myself it was tough love. But it wasn't love at all. It was cowardice. The cafe had gone quiet. Other patrons were pretending not to listen, but the silence was too heavy to ignore. You turned to opioids to numb the trauma, Jonathan continued. I turned to work to numb the guilt. Same wound. Different painkillers. Only one of us got labeled an addict. But we were both running from the same ghost, the accident, the loss, the unbearable weight of being the ones who survived. He reached across the table, not quite touching David's hand, but close. So yes, this is about my guilt, my need for redemption, my desperate attempt to do one thing right after decades of doing everything wrong. But it's also about you deserving better than a warehouse and tarps and charity from strangers. You deserve a real shot at recovery. Not because it'll make me feel better, but because you matter. Because you're my brother, and I failed you. And I can't change the past, but I can be here now. Jonathan's chest heaved. If you don't want my help, I'll respect that. But please don't refuse it because you think you don't deserve it. You do. God, David, you deserve so much more than what I gave you. Silence settled over the table. David stared at his brother. This billionaire who'd just broken open in a cafe, who'd finally said the words that had been buried for 22 years. When David spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Mom's last words in the ambulance. Do you remember them? Jonathan nodded, throat too tight to speak. Take care of your brother, David quoted. I was there. Heard her say it. And for 22 years, I've hated you for not keeping that promise. The words should have hurt, but Jonathan welcomed them. They were honest. Real. But I never kept my end either, David continued. Never let you take care of me. Pushed you away, blamed you, used your guilt as justification for my own destruction. We've both been failing her for 2 decades. He finally met Jonathan's eyes. I'll go to your facility. The fancy 90-day place with the specialists and the holistic approaches and the 72% success rate. Hope flickered in Jonathan's chest. But on one condition, David added. Anything. You come with me. David's jaw set with determination. Not to drop me off and write checks. To family therapy. Every session they'll let you attend. You face your demons while I face mine. We stop running from the same ghost together. Jonathan's breath caught. David, if I'm going to do this, really do this, I need to know it's not just me getting fixed while you stay broken, David said. We both need help, John. Different kinds, maybe, but we both need it. So either we do this together, or I keep doing what I'm doing on my own with NA meetings and Natalie's leftovers. It was the last thing Jonathan had expected. He'd come prepared to fund recovery, arrange logistics, solve problems with money and resources. He hadn't expected to be asked to face his own wounds alongside his brothers. But looking at David, this man who'd survived homelessness and addiction and abandonment, who was still fighting for sobriety with nothing but church basements and borrowed courage, Jonathan realized this was exactly what they both needed. Yes, he said immediately. Yes, together. David exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath for 5 years. Okay then. They reached across the table and shook hands. First physical contact in half a decade that wasn't wrapped in emergency or goodbye. Their grips were firm, tentative, hopeful. Across the cafe, partially hidden behind a menu, Natalie watched with tears streaming down her face. Ricardo sat beside her, coffee untouched, finally understanding why his daughter had been sneaking out at midnight for 7 months. Understanding that sometimes the greatest act of love isn't grand gestures or expensive solutions. Sometimes it's just showing up when everyone else has walked away, and refusing to let anyone, even billionaires who've forgotten how, face their demons alone. 6 months had passed since that afternoon in the cafe when two brothers shook hands and agreed to face their demons together. David completed his 90-day inpatient program at Turning Point Recovery Center on a Thursday in September, walking out the front entrance with a duffel bag of belongings and 187 days of sobriety under his belt. Jonathan was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his Tesla, and when their eyes met, neither spoke. They just stood there for a moment, acknowledging what words couldn't capture. They'd both done the work. They weren't healed. The therapist had been clear about that. Trauma doesn't disappear after 3 months of sessions and honest conversations. Addiction doesn't vanish because you want it to badly enough. But they were healing. Day by difficult day, session by painful session, they were learning to carry their grief together instead of apart. And that made all the difference. The dinner was Jonathan's idea, small, intimate, nothing like the business affairs he usually hosted. Just family. Real family. Not the transactional kind built on venture capital and networking. Ricardo had prepared the meal with obvious pride, his hands moving through Jonathan's industrial kitchen with the confidence of an artist in his element. Coq au vin, the same dish Natalie had portioned into containers 8 months ago. Roasted vegetables with herbs. Artisan bread. The kind of food meant to nourish, not just impress. Natalie served, wearing her red apron, moving between the table and kitchen with quiet grace. But this time, she wasn't working in shadows at midnight. She was here, acknowledged, celebrated. For the first time in decades, the Ashford brothers sat across from each other at a dining table as family. David looked different, not just healthier, though he'd gained 20 pounds of muscle and his skin had lost that gray, hollowed quality, but present. His eyes were clear, focused, alert in a way Jonathan hadn't seen since before their parents died. He wore clothes that fit, hair trimmed neatly, beard shaped deliberately instead of grown from neglect. He looked like someone with a future. "This is incredible, Ricardo," David said, savoring a bite of the coq au vin. "Seriously, best meal I've had in, God, I don't even know how long." "Since the warehouse," Natalie interjected with a small smile. "When I brought you this exact dish 8 months ago, and you cried." David laughed, a real laugh, unself-conscious and warm. "I didn't cry." "You absolutely cried," she countered. "Okay, fine. I cried a little," David admitted. "But that's because someone finally treated me like I was worth feeding with dignity. Not just worth a handout, but worth the good plates and proper portions and presentation. That mattered more than the food." Natalie's eyes shimmered. "You mattered more than the food." Ricardo cleared his throat, clearly emotional. "My daughter has always had the biggest heart. Even when she was little, bringing home stray cats, sharing her lunch with kids who forgot theirs. I just didn't realize how big until Mr. Ashford told me what she'd been doing. She saved my life," David said simply. "I was clean. Yeah, going to meetings, but I was surviving, not living. She reminded me that someone cared if I woke up the next morning. And that made all the difference." Jonathan's throat tightened. "She reminded me too, that I'd been running from the one person I should have been running toward." The conversation flowed, nervous at first, then gradually more natural. They shared stories, laughed at old memories that didn't hurt quite as much anymore, acknowledged the long road still ahead. David talked about his sponsor, the coping strategies he'd learned, the daily work of staying sober. Jonathan talked about therapy, about finally confronting his guilt over the accident, about learning that some things couldn't be fixed with money but could be faced with honesty. They were different, scarred and careful, and still learning how to be brothers again. But they were trying, and that was enough. After dessert, Jonathan set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, the gesture he used before every major announcement. "I have something to discuss," he said. "A business proposal, actually." David's expression flickered with wariness. "John, hear me out," Jonathan interrupted gently. "I've been working on something. The Ashford Housing Initiative. Converting abandoned properties into transitional housing for people in recovery. Not shelters, actual homes. Private rooms, communal kitchens, on-site support services, job placement assistance. Places where people can rebuild their lives with dignity." Ricardo and Natalie exchanged glances. David listened, face unreadable. "We've acquired 3 properties so far," Jonathan continued. "The funding is secured. Architects are on board. But I need someone to run the resident services program. Someone who understands what it's like to need that kind of support. Someone with first-hand experience navigating addiction, housing insecurity, the gap between surviving and living." He looked directly at David. "I'm offering you the position. Director of Resident Services. Full salary, benefits, your own apartment if you want it. It's not charity, it's strategic hiring. Your experience makes you uniquely qualified." David stared at him, processing. "You want me to, what? Run a recovery program? I want you to help people who are where you were 6 months ago," Jonathan said. "Who are clean but don't have a bridge back to stability. Who need more than meetings and good intentions. Who need someone who understands because they've been there. John, I've been sober for 6 months. 187 days, Jonathan corrected. And you've been working recovery longer than that. For months before I found you, according to Natalie. You know what works. What doesn't. What people actually need versus what privileged donors think they need." David's hands trembled slightly. "I could relapse." "You could," Jonathan acknowledged. "Or you could thrive. Build something meaningful. Help others while helping yourself. Give back the kind of support Natalie gave you." Tears streamed down David's face. He didn't bother wiping them away. "You really think I can do this?" "I know you can," Jonathan said firmly. "Because you've already done the hardest part. You survived. Now let's help others do the same." David nodded, unable to speak, and accepted his brother's hand across the table. Ricardo raised his glass. "To second chances." "To second chances," they echoed, glasses clinking in the expensive silence of a home that finally felt like more than just walls and wealth. 1 year later, the Ashford Housing Initiative had opened 3 facilities across the city. 47 residents total, each with their own recovery journey. Each with support and dignity and a place to call home while they rebuilt. David thrived in his role in ways Jonathan never could have predicted. He worked 12-hour days sometimes, leading group sessions, coordinating with therapists and job placement services, personally checking in with every resident. He knew their names, their struggles, their small victories. He celebrated 90-day milestones and supported through relapses without judgment. "You can't save everyone," his sponsor reminded him during their weekly coffee meetings. "You can just show up." And David showed up. Every single day, Jonathan discovered that investing in people yielded returns no stock portfolio could match. Not financial returns, though the initiative was surprisingly sustainable, but human ones. Every resident who found stable employment, every family reunited, every life redirected away from the edge. Those were dividends that compounded in ways his empire never had. He spent less time in boardrooms and more time at the facilities, learning names, hearing stories, understanding that wealth without purpose was just expensive loneliness. Natalie received a letter in April, a full scholarship to the Culinary Institute of America, funded by an anonymous donor. She called Jonathan immediately, voice shaking with disbelief. "You didn't," she said. "David, and I thought you might like it," Jonathan replied. "Consider it a very late thank you for saving our lives." She cried, then laughed, then cried again. Ricardo stood beside her, beaming with pride at the daughter who'd taught a billionaire what real wealth looked like. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the 4th facility was scheduled for a Saturday in June. The location was significant. The renovated warehouse where Natalie had delivered midnight meals, where David had lived in a room made of tarps, where everything had changed. Architects had transformed it into something beautiful. 20 private studio apartments, a communal kitchen and dining area, counseling offices, a library, green space in the courtyard where the concrete had been. The camping lantern was gone, replaced by proper lighting. The tarps were gone, replaced by walls and doors and dignity. But the bones remained. The industrial history. The reminder of where people had been and how far they'd come. A crowd gathered, city officials, donors, residents from the other facilities, volunteers from St. Catherine's Church. Media cameras captured the moment for news segments about innovative solutions to housing insecurity. Jonathan stood at the microphone first, offering brief remarks about the initiative's mission and thanking the team. Then he stepped aside. "I'd like to introduce someone who understands this work better than anyone," Jonathan said. "Our Director of Resident Services, my brother, David Ashford." David approached the microphone, visibly nervous. He'd gained more weight, looked healthier than Jonathan had seen him in 20 years. But it was his eyes that had changed most. They held hope now, purpose, the knowledge that he mattered. "A little over a year ago," David began, voice steady despite his nerves, "I was living in this warehouse. Room made of tarps, camping lantern, sleeping bag on cardboard. I'd been clean for 97 days, attending meetings at St. Catherine's, convinced I was worthless. Convinced my family had given up on me because I'd given them every reason to." He paused, scanning the crowd until he found Natalie standing with her father. Then a 17-year-old girl I'd helped months earlier started showing up at midnight, bringing food, real food, carefully portioned, served with dignity, bringing clean clothes, and most importantly, bringing the simple message that someone remembered I was human, that I mattered enough to show up for. Natalie wiped tears from her face. "That's what this place represents," David continued. "Not just housing, not just programs, but the radical idea that people experiencing addiction and homelessness deserve more than handouts. They deserve dignity, support, and someone who shows up, even at midnight, even when it's inconvenient, even when they're convinced they're not worth saving." His voice cracked. "This facility exists because of Natalie Torres, a teenager who saw someone everyone else walked past and decided to care, who refused to let me stay invisible, who taught two stubborn brothers that family isn't about blood or money. It's about showing up, even at midnight, when no one else will." The audience erupted into applause. Natalie buried her face in her father's shoulder, overwhelmed. David waited for silence to return. "If you're struggling, if you're watching from wherever you are and thinking you're too far gone, you're not. It's never too late for a second chance. Sometimes you just need one person to show up and remind you that you matter." Standing ovation. Camera flashes. Jonathan's eyes burned with tears he didn't bother hiding. After the ceremony, after the speeches and photos and congratulations, the three of them, Jonathan, David, and Natalie, stood in the renovated warehouse kitchen where it had all begun. "Should I pack some leftovers?" Natalie joked, gesturing at the catered reception food. They all laughed. Real, healing laughter that echoed in the space where so much pain had been transformed into purpose. Jonathan looked at his brother, healthy, sober, thriving, and the teenager who'd saved them both by refusing to let either of them face their demons alone. "You know," Jonathan said quietly, "I spent my whole life building an empire. Towers of glass and steel, billions in the bank. I thought that was my legacy." He gestured around the transformed warehouse, at the apartments above them that would house 20 people rebuilding their lives. "But this," he continued, "this is my greatest achievement. Not the buildings or the money. This, us. The people will help because someone taught us what actually matters." David nodded, voice thick with emotion. "Some debts can't be measured in dollars. Some investments pay dividends that compound forever," Natalie added softly. Jonathan smiled through tears. "And sometimes, the most important midnight delivery isn't food, it's hope." They stood together in comfortable silence. A billionaire, a recovering addict, and a teenager with a red apron who'd understood before either of them that showing up was the only currency that truly mattered. Outside, the sun set over the city, casting golden light through the windows of a warehouse that had witnessed despair and was now a monument to second chances. Not because of money or power or grand gestures, but because one person decided to care when caring was inconvenient. and reminded two brothers that the distance between abandonment and redemption was just 5 feet and the courage to stop running. If this story hit you harder than you expected, don't just scroll past like Jonathan and David are fictional characters. Right now, someone in your life might be living in their own warehouse, isolated, convinced they're not worth saving, waiting for someone to show up. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories that remind us what actually matters, and drop a comment telling me which moment broke you the most. Was it Natalie packing food at midnight? Jonathan finding David alive in that warehouse? The brothers shaking hands in the cafe? Or David's speech at the ribbon cutting? Type the chapter number and the moment that hit different. Because if a 17-year-old girl can change 2 lives with leftover food and midnight courage, imagine what showing up for someone today could do. Your comment might be the reminder someone else needs to reach out to their own David. So don't just watch, participate. Comment your favorite part below, and let's build a community that believes second chances aren't just possible, they're worth fighting for.